So I'm going to be brief. I don't really have much of a presentation. I think I'm here to argue against ethics in journalism. I suspect that I was invited here because I gave an interview to Sylvia's newspaper a couple months ago where the reporter asked me my thoughts on ethics in journalism. And my answer was that I think of journalism ethics in the same way I think of plumber ethics, which is that I think we are all, as people, bound by certain ethical precepts. Don't lie to people, don't steal, don't break the law. But the sort of superstructure of professional ethics that have been applied on top of journalism as a profession, I think, have been used in a lot of ways to keep out people who aren't in the priesthood. To give a sense that there's something special and unique about what we do, and elevate our profession over the sort of the hoi polloi, and I don't think that's really a good thing. So when I confront ethical questions in my career, I look at them as a person interacting with other people and try to do right by them. As opposed to as a member of a class. So, you know, before I came here, I was looking at the Society of Professional Journalists ethical guidelines, and you know, it's useful, but it says things like "don't plagiarize," which I don't really consider to be a professional obligation on journalists as much as a sort of moral and ethical obligation on people. Another one that was in there is don't use misleading headlines, which I think the ship has sailed on that one. And it sailed, you know, in the tabloid era. You know, that's sort of the point of tabloid journalism, is to use sensational headlines to draw people into your stories. One of the in terms of the way technology has affected the way we approach ethical questions, I think that one of the reasons that I like to think of my ethical obligations not in a professional context but just in a personal context is that obviously you know, almost everyone in America, and I don't know what the sort of broadband penetration is globally, but a hell of a lot of people around the world have access to exactly the same audience that I do, potentially. So, you know, and a lot of the ethical questions that I've confronted as a reporter and as an editor at Gawker are often about how I approach doing stories that there might be good reasons not to do, but are already on the internet. When Richard Engel was kidnapped in Syria, or they didn't know he was kidnapped, he disappeared in Syria. That story was in Turkish media, it was on Twitter, it was everywhere, and you know, one of the questions I had to confront was, well, you know, it's out there on the internet. I've just got one little website over here. Probably more people have read it on Twitter and in Turkish media than will ever read it on Gawker. But what's the ethical responsibility that I have to him and to his colleagues in terms of disclosing that information and pointing people to the fact of it in all these other outlets. But I think, you know, one of the things that the technology has done is we talk about the sort of promise of the citizen journalist, which I think, and a lot of people talked about that in terms of individual access to internet technology and being able to find large audiences, even if it's all you have is a Twitter feed. That would somehow involve an elevation of the citizen to the level of journalist. And I think what I prefer is a devolution of the journalist to the level of citizen, so that what we're doing is communicating with one another conversationally, and the ethical considerations in that are about the same ethical considerations that you would have when you're talking to your friends. That there's not much of a difference anymore between you know, communicating to people over Twitter and communicating to a large audience over a website. At least not much of a difference in ethical terms. The other point I want to make, and I'll conclude with this, is that some fantastic journalism has been produced using extremely unethical and potentially criminal means. You know, the sort of avatar of the great story is Watergate, and in pursuing Watergate, Carl Bernstein called a friend of his at the phone company and pulled someone's phone records. Now, that act would arguably be criminal today. It certainly stretches the bounds of what most of the sort of priesthood would describe as ethical journalism, but it was an integral part of landing that story. They also, I don't remember if it was Woodward or Bernstein that did it, but they also pulled someone's credit card records because someone had a friend at the bank. So when we talk about these ethical issues, we need to remember that, Sylvia mentioned sort of thinking situationally, that there are a lot of situations in which, you know, if we're going to speak in broad, strict terms about the proper behavior of someone we're going to call a journalist, and I don't call myself a journalist, by the way, because I like to have a ready answer to a question that I frequently get, which is, how can you call yourself a journalist? I call myself a reporter and an editor. You know, when we address these questions, we need to remember that, you know, those kinds of tactics have landed huge stories. And it really didn't, you know, in the era of Watergate, those acts, which they revealed, and, you know, if you read the book, All the President's Men, they're kind of ashamed of that. Like, they realize that these tactics stretch the bounds. And, you know, if that had been disclosed today, I think in a similar story, I think it would potentially shut the story down. It would be used to discredit the reporters and discredit the reporting. The same way in the Chiquita Banana case, in the Cincinnati Enquirer, which was, as far as I know, an accurate story, but the reporters they got access to the Chiquita Banana's voicemail system, and instead of just the source giving them audio files, they actually used the password to access the system, which was a crime. And the result of that was that the story was discredited, even though the facts of the story were, as far as I know, not in question. Some of the other people on the panel might know a little bit more about the case. And I think, you know, we need to think about the consequences of applying these kinds of strict standards to individual stories. Another one that comes up a lot is the Telegraph in England did a tremendous service to the people of that country by revealing the expenses that the members of parliament used taxpayer dollars to pay for the upkeep of their moats and other insane things, to have pay for 2 houses, one of which they rented out and got income from. There were the huge abuses, and they paid for that information. And in the context of American journalism, that's an ethical no-no. Well, you know, is it worth you know, abiding by these rules if at the end of the day you're actually not getting out that vital information? And I guess I'll end with you know, one of the other things that comes up when we talk about the ethics of reporting. Frequently we push off the ethical, the dirty part of the ethical decisions onto our sources, and so that we can keep clean. And an example would be a situation like the Chiquita Banana situation. If that source had simply, you know, committed the ethical and potentially criminal violations by accessing the voicemail system and giving it to the reporter would be able to keep his or her hands clean. I had a similar situation where when I was at Gawker, someone hacked into Mitt Romney's email, and they sent me an email that said, "I've hacked into Mitt Romney's email, I have his password." And that was it. And what I wanted to do, and what I would have done if like a friend of mine had said this, is, well, shit, what's in it? But I couldn't, because it would have been criminal. It would have been it was a criminal act to hack into his email, and it would have implicated me in a conspiracy. So I just had to say, wow. And, that was, what I really, really wanted him to do was for him to take the burden of the unethical behavior and then just give me the benefits of it. And in which case I would have, printed plenty of it because I'm sure a lot of it would have been newsworthy. But at the end of the day, he didn't give me anything, and he eventually I think he was arrested. I think he was Canadian, actually. So I'll end with that story. As one of the things to keep in mind is that part of what we do when we purport to behave ethically is we're actually asking other people to behave unethically.